So we are trying to basically give you all the knowledge we have combined about to prove that Europe is cool again, and Europe in the digital economy will be a vital place and the right place for your expansion. Let me introduce you, Andrea. He's Mr. Digital for the European Commission, based in Washington, D.C. for 3.5 years now, and he survived 2 administrations so far, and I think he has a lot of experience in explaining Europe and the EU for American audiences, including American businesses. I think here on the West Coast, it's especially important that Europe should pull its own weight, and I think that there's a natural tendency and a natural perception of going towards Asia, but I think we have to build a case for Europe. And why is that? Well, lesser known fact that the EU and the US are the closest partners of each other economically, especially in the sector of services. Europe itself is the largest economic and trading bloc in the whole wide world, and there are lots of liaisons which have created a transatlantic business space already de facto, but of course there's a lot of cooperation on the regulatory level and also on the level of businesses which need to be exploited. So first of all, Andrea, my first question to you is that we are seeing a lot of cultural differences, but also a lot of cultural similarities between the EU and the US. What would be the case you would put in front of the audiences about Europe's vision in the digital economy, the investments into the digital economy for American audiences?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. And I would start by saying that, by the way, Europe has always been cool. It's not becoming cool again. I would indeed refer everybody to the cultural dimension and to the historical dimension and, in a sense, to the business dimension. I think that people very often underestimate the extent to which there already are incredibly tight and close links, not only economically, but also culturally and politically to a large extent between Europe and the US. And that's a capital that I think sometimes people discount a little bit. With all due respect to other parts of the world, I think that sometimes people here in the US do not quite understand how easy it is to go to Europe and do business within environments that, by and large, with some differences, but come from the same root in terms of what it means to have a coherent regulatory environment, in terms of what it means to have independent enforcement authorities for whatever field of enforcement one might look at. And again, I said that with respect to other parts of the world, but it's a reality that Europe and the US developed to a significant extent along similar routes. And so what I would say to people who are considering an international expansion from the US, certainly from the West Coast and from the LA area, but from the US in general, is do not fall prey of easy sirens, so to speak, and think that, well, we absolutely need to go to Asia as our only option. For all the reasons that I mentioned, I would also point out that Europe, as you mentioned yourself, George, is a continent of 500 million citizens, many of which are consumers, and they're quite well-paying consumers because our standard of living are pretty high. So that's certainly, from my point of view, from our point of view, a very interesting proposition for anybody who has to decide at a certain point in time where to export his products or services.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about data a little bit, which is in your area, definitely. So lesser known fact again, the data flows between the EU and the US are 15 terabits per second right now, which is 50% higher than US-China and 400% higher on a per capita basis already. So this is an immense data flow we're having. Now, everybody has probably heard at this stage that data is the fuel, the oil of the new economy, and I would love your take on the regulatory aspects of data, whatever you're seeing right now coming out of the Commission for US businesses, which are, some of them are at the policy level, some of them are real facts, what the US businesses have to prepare for.
Absolutely. Well, again, first of all, I would start from your own depiction of the situation, George, which is that we already have impressively strong data flows between Europe and the US. And people sometimes tend to focus a lot on whatever small difference of views or problems we might have between Europe and the US in terms of, for example, the approach to privacy law, or as we like to call it in Europe, personal data protection policies and law. And those differences exist, and as it happens between friends, we should not be afraid between Europe and the US to face those differences and discuss about them, but this does not detract from the fact that those data flows are already happening, are already existing, and they have for a very long time. Now, having said that, one thing that I think European companies have to, American companies have to consider when to move to Europe is there are both cultural, I would say, and hard policy and regulatory differences which have to be taken into account. From a cultural point of view, I don't want to bore the audience with the whole history of Europe, but I think it's important to keep in mind that for Europeans, the notion of how our data is used, how our personal data is used, for what purpose, is something that strikes a very deep chord in our hearts. And the reason for that is that not long ago, our fascist, Nazist, and for some of our member states, it's even more recent, communist regimes used that data, used personal data for all kinds of nefarious purposes. Again, to simplify, in many cases, the data was used to decide whether somebody should go to a concentration camp or not. So this is not the situation today, to be clear, but it's still very much deeply embedded into the European psyche that you got to be careful with the personal data that you collect. And that is somehow, I'm not saying that Americans are necessarily too cavalier about their data, but certainly as a European in the US, my experience is that Americans don't pay as much attention as we Europeans do about that. So that's the cultural side. On the regulatory side, and as a consequence, obviously, of the political and cultural debates, we do have different pieces of legislation at the European level. We have something which many of you might have heard about, the so-called General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which will become, it's already law, it will become enforceable in May 2018. I think people are very scared about this particular piece of legislation, when at the end of the day, what this legislation says is, if you collect data and if you process data, to use the technical term in the law, that's fine. I mean, we don't object to that, but you need to have a so-called legal basis. You need to either have the consent of the person that you collect the data from, or you need to have other good reasons to do that. And you need, at any given point in time, you need to be able to explain what's happening to that data. Where is it going? Who are you giving it to? How are you, for example, using the data for profiling purposes, which is fine in many cases. So it's all about accountability and explaining what's happening with that data. And my sense sometimes is that American companies, they either read articles on newspapers and they get very scared and don't really get into the details of what they can or they cannot do, or conversely, and that's unfortunate to be very blunt, they just come to Europe or operate with Europe or to sell services to Europe, thinking that they can apply California or US rules. And that is simply not possible, quite frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these mindset differences are very deeply rooted in that regard. And I just read a study a few days ago, I think it was made by Accenture, saying that Europe is investing heavily into the digital transformation of the economy. The estimated amount of value, what is being prepared by the digital economy, is about 4 billion euros a day, which is basically the GDP of Spain in a year. So what is going on that front is that the value that has been produced by the digital economy, half of it goes to society as direct value, and half of it goes to businesses. So I think it's very important to stress that there is a unique European approach to, like, there is a European model, and Europe is stressing that it wants to play the rules of the digital economy according to the social model and societal model that Europe has built.
That's absolutely true. And again, one thing that people who want to expand to Europe or work with Europe have to realize is that, first of all, we have been investing quite heavily, certainly from a policy regulatory side, in order to reduce the fragmentation, which, I'll be very honest, still exists among some member states of the European Union in terms of how they approach the different facets of the digital economy, whether it comes to cybersecurity or privacy or other areas. We are working on that. I think we're at a very good stage. I will not be, let's not be dishonest. To a large extent, in the US, there is more harmonization across the different states in terms of digital rules than there is in Europe. That's because we, different history, different political systems. Maybe the US started a little bit before from this point of view, but we are proceeding very quickly. And I would suggest that companies which want to expand to Europe have to pay attention to these policy and regulatory developments, because it will have an impact on their operation, their choices. And secondly, as you were pointing out, George, I take quite often when I talk to my US interlocutors in whichever administration that might be or with businesses here in the US, I take pride with the fact that in Europe we started to ask rather uncomfortable questions on the role, on the impact of the digital economy, of digitally enabled companies in many sectors of society. For example, the impact of these companies on the labor market. Sorry, not the company specifically, but the impact of these changes, or these digital changes on the labor market, the impact on taxation policy, the role, for example, of the interface between law enforcement authorities or consumer protection authorities and online platforms. Now, I'm not saying that we have necessarily the right answer. My point is that we have started thinking about these issues in a moment in which, to be perhaps a bit undiplomatic, I shouldn't be doing it since I am a diplomat technically, but to be a bit undiplomatic, in the US, these debates were not happening. And again, I think that companies have a very important role to play here because especially American companies, all American companies, not only the Silicon Valley giants, all American companies can and should, in my view, come to Europe and maybe not explain, but present their perspective on how they feel we can be proactive and forward-looking in addressing these issues. However, again, to be very blunt, if a company wants to expand in Europe and simply says, well, you know what, I really don't care about European labor rules, I really don't care about European privacy rules, which, let's be honest, has been the case for some American companies in the past, that is not going to be met with let's say, good reactions. I don't want to scare anybody. I think that we can have a dialogue there, and we should have a dialogue, but it's also important to understand that that dialogue has to be between peers. We're not going to be lectured by anyone on how our model should develop. We're ready to learn. That's a different approach.
Mm-hmm. And this, this part of the story has been heavily mediatized in Silicon Valley, where I live. Mm. So I'm sure you have a lot of experiences with, U.S. companies
complaining.
Yeah, complaining, and having some radical thoughts on Europe. Where do you think it is going right now? I mean, people reading the news about fines and lawsuits and all that kind of thing. Do you think that there is constructive dialogue happening now, or what are the points of improvement right now, which affect even smaller companies than the Googles of the world?
I think it's very important to underline that smaller company element, because unfortunately, in the past few years, the dialogue in the digital environment from US business vis-a-vis Europe has been dominated by a very few, very large companies coming from a very specific part of the US, which is just north of where we are now. And not all companies in the US are that size or have that particular business model and raise the kind of concerns that those companies raise. What I personally miss is that I've been missing a lot is the presence of those smaller companies, smaller, not meaning micro companies, but definitely small and medium enterprises in the debate. Their voice has not been heard. Maybe we have not been very good at listening to those voices. I think part of it is also that those companies have not made their voice heard. And that's unfortunate, and we should try to change it. And I would be very happy to hear proposals on how we can do better to build the dialogue. On the substance, I'll be very short. There is indeed, there has been for some time, this narrative that somehow Europe, the European authorities or the European Commission, the executive of the European Union, the institution that I proudly work for, have somehow been targeting American companies and specifically Silicon Valley companies, whether it's about privacy or antitrust. Look, all I can say is that we have the numbers, we can show the numbers to demonstrate that that is factually untrue. In any particular field of enforcement, we have not targeted American companies. On the other hand, if you are a company of whichever nationality, American, Chinese, French, German, whatever, and you have a 90% market share in Europe, all across the European Union, which means in technical terms you have a dominant position, you have to expect that you are going to be subject to more regulatory scrutiny than any other company. And this is true, by the way, both in Europe and in the US. If I may give just another example, because it just reflects how bizarre these conversations sometimes are. Another criticism that has been coming from American companies, and to a certain extent even from the previous administration, is that we, as Europe, we are running after these American companies also from a taxation point of view. And the case in Ireland, we have an open case with Ireland, and the fact that in our view Apple has been granted illicitly a particular favored treatment for tax purposes. What people don't realize is that our investigation on that matter started because of a US Congress hearing on exactly the same issue, on how Apple or Silicon Valley in general was paying or not taxes. So all of these debates were coming actually from the US, and we simply followed up.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Another fuel of the digital economy is talent and the availability of talent, besides data. And 2 data points on that. The quantity of mobile developers produced by Europe on a yearly basis is 1.5 times that of the US. And the quality of developers, if there were a developer Olympics, the first 5 spots, in the top 10, there are 5 spots occupied by Eastern European or Central and Eastern European developers. So both the quantity and the quality is available in Europe. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want it. That's always a bit of a tricky thing for me to get into because I don't want to be disrespectful towards the US, which is a great country with a great academic system and produces a lot of great talent. But having said that, it is certainly true that, in particular, as you mentioned, Central and Eastern European countries have had a very long history of investing education-wise in STEM and mathematics, pure mathematics. It is certainly true that on average our higher education system, the university system, I think that my perhaps non-scientific assessment is that in the US there are these really top-tier universities with great funding, etc. Harvard, Yale, you see the whole University of California system. But on average, in Europe, it's still much easier to get to very good universities. Chiefly, quite frankly, because universities are much cheaper in Europe than they are in the US, so many more people can actually go there. Now, having said that, I think we have, if I may perhaps redirect a little bit the question, yes, there is the talent in Europe, and I think people should look at it very carefully when they decide to expand there, when US businesses decide to expand there. On the other hand, we are also facing very similar issues, education-wise, in the US and in Europe, and I would say in the rest of the world, but I will focus only on the transatlantic dimension, chiefly that the whole job, all industries are changing. And my job title is Counselor for the Digital Economy, and I keep on telling my superiors that my job title doesn't make any sense at all, because nobody has managed to define nowadays what the non-digital economy is. And what I mean by that is that very traditional sectors, transportation, mining, the health sector, you name it, is becoming digital. And the question is, do we have, what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years? Are we producing the people with the right skills for those sectors? Or the people who already work in those sectors, are we, quote unquote, reskilling them? This is an area where I think Europe and the US should work a lot more than they are together to try to find flexible solutions, which do not necessarily pass for everybody should go to college or university. That's frankly unrealistic for many industries. And that's an area where I think we should cooperate a lot more. And again, the role of businesses there is absolutely key, because it's businesses that can tell regulators that we really need this kind of skills. It's not regulators, and I work for, among other things, a regulator. We have no idea what are the skills that are actually needed on the market. We're not very good at finding it. We need businesses to tell us. That doesn't mean that we should change our education system only to what businesses want, but still that input from the US and from European businesses is absolutely central.
Mm-hmm. So we only have very few minutes remaining, so let's get practical, giving advice to US companies. First of all, what I see that US companies usually lack is having a Europe-level strategy of expansion, or an EU-level strategy of expansion, which are 2 different things. So usually they jump into like, hey, I want to go to Germany, or my cousin liked Amsterdam and we are expanding there, or they are making the decision based on tax laws only. So I really believe in a hybrid model of expansion, and not doing a deep dive, but actually feel out the market and be very strategic about it, establishing partnerships first, getting some European funding is available, the Horizon 2020 program, which is basically the big $80 billion innovation program available from the European Union. So what would be your advice on companies having a Europe and an EU strategy?
First of all, that they should have such a strategy. I see many companies just coming to Europe for, with the kind of criteria that you mentioned. That is not a strategy. And Europe is much like the US, by the way, but Europe is to a certain extent a complex environment, and you cannot just jump in and hope to be successful, or to be successful at scale in that way. So having a strategy is very important. I think it's very important to have some kind of physical presence in there. And what I mean by that, you don't necessarily need to have somebody in Europe. Some companies can afford it, some companies cannot, but to have partners with whom you can work. Third thing, do not take your time to understand how the European policy and regulatory system actually works. With all due respect to all Americans in the room, I am amazed by even very big companies, very big US companies, which are either present in Europe or are planning to go to Europe, to the European Union, are quite bluntly ignorant about the regulatory, the basics of how European Union law is made. And part of that is, don't forget that at least when it comes to commercial matters, the kind of stuff that most businesses are interested in, as opposed to military cooperation or geostrategic consideration, when it comes to what we call internal market policies, a good 80% of legislation, regulation, etc., is decided in Brussels at the union level. I see many companies going to whatever member state, I will not name names, and thinking that just by knowing what happens in the member state, they can be successful. They need to know what happens nationally or locally, but they also need to know what's happening in Europe at the European level. And last point, last suggestion that I might have, I know that many companies decide to move to country, member state, A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever that might be, mostly on a tax basis, for tax purposes. I would caution, and I'm not prejudging whatever is going to happen in the next few months, but I would caution against that because one, there will always be another member state which competes on tax purposes and tries to cut the other member state by granting tax breaks. Secondly, the current situation of very widely different tax regimes in different member states, which is legally possible in our system, but is becoming increasingly politically unsustainable. So I would not at all be surprised if the next year or a couple of years we would see changes from that point of view. And so if your strategy of moving to Europe is entirely based on whatever tax breaks you could get in member state A, B, C, D, or whatever, I would be careful from the point of view.
We are over time, so bottom line, take your time with Europe. Have a clear strategy, have a broad strategy at the Europe level and the EU level. And in Europe, you know what you get because of the cultural similarities, but the devil is in the details. So have knowledgeable people on the ground who can help you.
Absolutely.